Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternities, the Expanse book to show comparison for Season 1, Episode 1, Dalcina. This video is the first in a series of videos where I compare the events in the Expanse TV series to that of the source material, the Expanse novels. This video will feature spoilers up to the end of Season 1 of the Expanse, but will not intentionally feature spoilers from the novels that have yet to occur in the show. So if you haven't read the novels, I will not spoil anything that hasn't occurred in the show past Season 2, but I will, however, spoil what happens in the first novel that Season 1 was based off of, as the whole point of this video is to point out the difference between the book and the show. So I'd originally wanted to do one video comparing Season 1 to Book 1 of The Expanse. However, I realized I had way too much to say and such a video would be way too long, so I decided instead to do a series of videos where I compare each episode to the novels on which it is based. Now, I just read the novels for the first time recently, a few months ago, so my first experience was the TV show, so I wouldn't by any means call myself an expert on the books or anything like that. I'm just a guy who noticed the difference and wanted to point them out. So I may get a few things wrong from time to time and miss out on a few things, but I'll try my best. So for these videos, I'll be using a point system to score whether I felt the adaptation from the show was better or worse than what appeared in the books. And I'll refer to this as adaptation points. I'll do this on a scale from -5 to 5. If I feel an adaptation is really terrible and absolute worst, I'll give it a -5. If it's only slightly worse than the books, I'll give it a -1. A 0 if it's neither better or worse than the books, and a 1 if it's slightly better than the books, and a 5 if it's extremely better than the books, and so on and so forth. And at the end of the video, I will add up the total to give my total adaptation score on the episode. So the episode begins with text that explains the situation with Earth, Mars, and the Belt, and of course no such text appears in the novels as it slowly disseminates this information, which of course makes sense because novels can do that where shows can't. It's a difference between the written and visual medium, so it makes sense to begin the show this way, otherwise it would be confusing. So I'm going to give this a score of 0 as it isn't as informative as the novels, but it works best with the visual medium and it's better than having nothing, and it helps set the stage for the show. However, part of what the text says is that tensions has been rising between Earth, Mars, and the Belt, which is a change from the novels and something I'll touch on more as we go along. While it's true in the novel the superpowers aren't so cozy, in the novels officially Earth and Mars have an alliance that spans control of the solar system pretty much equally. In fact, officially they are the best of friends, where there's a lot of hostility and resentment between the superpowers below the surface. Those feelings are very well hidden. In fact, the Belters barely tell the difference between them and often lump them together as inners. Some of that has carried over to the show, but it's more prominent in the novels, whereas in the show Earth and Mars are portrayed as very openly hostile towards one another, and relations between them are extremely poor, and they are in a somewhat Cold War type situation, whereas in the novels don't begin that way at all. So I'm actually going to give a +2 to the show here, because I actually think this works better to have them hostile towards each other from the very beginning rather than having this alliance. Plus, I commend the show for making this difference, as it would have been confusing for this format had they tried to play it like it was played in the novels. So first scene we get in the show is the same as the first scene we get in the novels, as the prologue of the first book. Leviathan awakes as Julie Mao being held captive as she hears the sounds of battle outside, and then struggles to find food or water, and then eventually breaks out of her cell only to be shocked by seeing the proto-molecule monster. The difference, though, is the novels goes for a lot longer on this and begins earlier, showing her and her shipmates being captured, and goes to describe the torture her shipmates endured. I think I'm going to give a +1 to the show here, as I think it makes the scene more ominous and foreboding to have less rather than more information about it. Plus, I felt the prologue in the novels was unnecessarily long. And I do commend the show for starting with this scene rather than trying to skip it, as it is kind of confusing for audiences who know nothing about the show and are watching it for the first time, but I feel it sets up some things nicely. So then we go over to Ceres Station and are given a lot of exposition of Ceres and the Belters and how they feel about the innards through a speech of an OPA supporter. Now, no such scene exists in the novels, but all the information, again, is given through like written word, like ruminations and thoughts and stuff like that, which can't be done in the same way on a TV show. So I thought this was a brilliant way to dispel exposition on the show while introducing us to the Belters, but I'm going to give it a 0, as it works well for the show, but isn't necessarily better than the books. Now, in this scene, the Belters refer to Miller as Walwala, which Miller explains means traitor to his people. And as far as I remember, this accusation was never outright made in the novel, certainly not in such a public setting, and was more of like an undercurrent some of the common folk felt about the police officers in general, whereas here it seems like they're accusing Miller of it specifically. I suppose this was done to try to introduce Miller's position as an Earth-paid Belter police officer, but I don't think it quite works, so I'm going to give it a -1. Also, in these first scenes, we're introduced to Havelock, Miller's partner. Now, in the novels, Havelock is also an Earther and thus treated like an outsider, but he's not a rookie. He's actually been on Ceres working with Miller for quite some time, and he and Miller have a much closer and more respectful relationship. I suppose they did it this way to try to introduce the Belt from an Earther's perspective to be like a surrogate for the audience, but I really don't think it was necessary, and I think they kind of ruined Havelock's character in the process, so I'm going to give this a -3. Next, we get a scene with Miller confronting a mistreated sex worker by speaking Belter to her. This is very similar to a scene in the novels, except I don't think there was a dead body involved in that case. At the very least, it wasn't in the room with them. But likewise in the novels, Havelock felt left out, but he didn't take it quite as hard, so I'll give this scene a 0. Then we get a quick bar scene of Miller and Havelock having a drink in a bar, where Miller explains the difference between Belters and Earthers to Havelock, which again never happens in the books because Havelock has been on Ceres for a while, but this is a way to explain this stuff to the audience, which again the novels could do through text where the show couldn't, so that's fine, I'll give it a 0. So next we get a scene with Miller talking to the mob guy or crime lord or whatever you want to call him, where they have an arrangement where Miller leaves him alone if he keeps things in the station running, like the air filters clean and stuff like that. While no such scene occurred in novels, it's implied that Miller did indeed have these types of deals going on, but the storyline in the novel with Miller focused more on an imbalance with the powerful gangs that run Ceres and how they were behaving strangely. This was an ongoing storyline that lasted several chapters and ended up leading to the revelation that these gangsters were being shipped to Eros by Protogen to serve as the security force to help them in their experiments that would kill the people of Eros. So I'm surprised they left this out in the show, as I think it would have worked well here as well, whereas the storyline with the mobster was kind of just there to establish what we kind of already knew, that air and water was important to the station and Miller could do whatever he could to keep it running. Well, although I liked how it depicted that Miller was a bit crooked but for noble purposes, I didn't think it was all that necessary, so I'll give it a -2. So we also get a scene with Miller receiving his orders on the side kidnap job for Julie Mal and to return her to her parents. But this scene went down pretty much exactly as it did in the books. I don't really have much to say about it. So then we move over to the Canterbury, where we get an establishing scene that establishes the Canterbury as an ice hauler. This is explained in detail in the novels, but here we visually see everything we need to know by showing an incident where a man got his arm chopped off by accident. Now, in the novels, this incident occurs a couple months beforehand, and we just see Holden in the medical bay watching his arm get repaired, but it makes sense to actually show it on screen as it helps set the stage for what the Canterbury does, so I'll give it +1. Then we get a sex scene between Holden and Canterbury's navigator, Ade Nagard. In the novels, Holden is having a sexual relationship with the Canterbury's navigator, Ade Tukundo, who is described as a woman of African descent with dark skin, so her character was changed slightly for the show. In the novels, we don't get an actual sex scene as we do here. We're just told that they're in a sexual relationship. Plus, their relationship is quite different than depicted here. Where here they seem to be in a full romantic relationship, even if O'Day describes it as a temporary relationship, whereas in the novels they just meet and have sex on occasion. In fact, the novels describes this as just another in a long line of such relationships Holden has with women on the Canterbury. In fact, in the novels, O'Day outright fights against the prospect of her being Holden's girlfriend. Where here, Ade seems fine with being Holden's girlfriend, but warns it will end soon once she's rotated off the ship, so it isn't anything long term. It's a subtle difference, but still a difference, so I'll give a 0 for this. We're then introduced to Amos and Naomi, and a scene similar to the novels when they're talking about repairing the ship, but I'll cover these two characters more in another video. For now, let me get to Holden as he's looking for the XO of the ship, and Amos jokes about the XO always being drunk, and Holden is described as the second officer. We then get a scene with Holden going into the XO's room to find none other than Breaking Bad's Jonathan Banks, who goes a bit insane and seems to be suffering from an acute case of space sickness. Now, this character outright does not exist in the novels, because in the novels Holden is the XO. This is followed up on by a scene where Captain McDowell tries to make Holden the XO, but he outright refuses. So this is a huge difference from the book when he's already the XO. And frankly, I like this change because, to be honest, in the novels, Holden comes off as kind of this stereotypical sci-fi first officer captain hero archetype. Whereas the show humanizes him more, and the storyline of him not really wanting to be XO and just wanting to float around seems a bit more real, so I'm going to give this a +3. So then we get a scene where the Canterbury gets a distress call from the Scopuli, where O'Day points out they're obligated to help, but Captain McDowell doesn't want to help as they would risk losing their payout. So he orders that the logs be erased and the message ignored, and O'Day is not happy about this, but Holden backs his play. Whereas in the novels, it is McDowell who calls Holden to the bridge and tells him about the distress call, and O'Day isn't even there. And Holden notes that if McDowell simply wanted to ignore it, he would have never told Holden about it in the first place. So he himself decides to go aid the Scopuli. It's kind of explained in the novels as an unspoken rule of the belt that everyone must come together, come to each other's aid when there's a call for distress call, otherwise no one would survive. Holden does ruminate that not everyone follows this unspoken rule, but most people do, and Captain McDowell is among them. In fact, the line in the show about letting the good god Darwin sort them out is a direct quote from the books, but rather than McDowell speaking it aloud, it was what Holden ruminates of, was what some others might think when they ignore distress calls, but they're not among them. To be honest, I kind of liked the way this was handled in the books better, as it seemed a little bit unnecessary here, so I'll give it a -1. So then we have a scene of Holden taking over the night shift, where he has a moment of conscience and logs the distress call against the captain's orders, which gets them all in trouble, which of course never happens in the novels. As I just explained, McDowell himself ordered them to respond to the distress call. Now, the actor who plays Holden noted this change in an interview and stated that he liked it a lot and thought it created a new dynamic for Holden. I don't quite agree. It kind of makes everything that happened to the Canterbury afterwards his fault in a way, and while some may find this a bit more poignant of a change, it's never really followed up on in any significant way, so I'm actually not a huge fan of it, so I'm going to give it a -1. So then we go to Avasarala on Earth, getting ready for work when her grandson comes in and throws a water balloon at her, and this scene is very similar to the scene in the novels and establishing Avasarala's relationship with her grandson. But I do need to address the elephant in the room, that Avasarala wasn't even in the first novel, Leviathan Wakes, and doesn't appear until the second novel, Caliban's War. So her part was greatly expanded in the show to what it was in the novels. And I absolutely loved this change and thought it was one of the smartest changes the show has made. As the first novel, Leviathan Wakes, there are only 2 viewpoint characters, Holden and Miller, other than the prologue and epilogue. So each chapter switches back and forth between these two, and thus the novel had a lot more focused narrative, especially when the two of them came together. Whereas the show opens it up more to be more like a Game of Thrones type ensemble story with multiple storylines going at the same time, and it will expand this even more as the show goes on. And plus, Avasarala is such a fascinating character, and it really pays to get Earth's perspective of these events. It really opens up the world of the Expanse and makes it feel more expansive and realistic. So I'm going to give this change a +5. However, the next scene we get of Avasarala is her torturing an OPA operative who attempted an act of terrorism on Earth. This is very different than the novels has. It establishes her of having a hatred of the OPA that she doesn't have in the novels, and she was never be in charge of torturing someone in such a way. That wasn't really her job description. In fact, in the show, I noted when I first saw this that she sort of came off as like Jack Bauer type, and she was never like that in the novels. Although the part about the natural gravity of Earth being tortured to a belter is in keeping with what's established in the novels, but still this made me think about something about Avasarala didn't actually match with their character even going forward in the show, so I'm going to give this a -1. So then we go back to the Canterbury, where McDowell discovers the distress call has been long, so they have to go after it, and he orders Holden to take a smaller ship to go after it. So they have to do this high-speed burn to go after it, which is pretty much the same in the novels, but in this scene they use the juice, that is the high cocktail of drugs to keep them conscious. That wasn't used in the novels at this point. It was used a bit later on, but I'm fine with the show doing it this way, so it gets a 0. We then see Holden, Naomi, Amos, and Alex, and Shed going on the shuttle the night after the Scopuli, which also, the same thing happens in the book pretty much. However, here McDowell tells Holden that if anything goes wrong, pack up the toys and come home, which is exactly what he said in the novels, except here Holden responds by saying, "No heroes, Captain," whereas in the novels, McDowell has to specifically tell Holden not to be a hero, not like before, so it's alluding to some past where Holden has gone out of his way to be a hero, which is quite different than here, where it seems like Holden has absolutely no desire to be a hero. Again, I think this sets his character up to be more human rather than a typical sci-fi hero, so I'll give this a +1. So then we go back to series where Miller is at a bar with Octavia Muss. she is flirting with some guy that Miller scares away so he can get her opinion on Julie Mao, and it is then implied in the scene that the two of them has had some prior relationship, as Miller says he misses her, but then she rejects him. Now, this is very different from the Octavia Muss in the novels, as this character doesn't even appear until much later in the story, as she's assigned to be Miller's partner after Havelock leaves the station. She most certainly does not have a past with Miller, and at first doesn't even like him. She's assigned to be his partner as punishment, as apparently he's looked on as a washed-up has-been that no one wants to work with, and so she's made his partner as punishment for rebuffing the sexual advances of a superior. However, the two of them do eventually get along, and she wishes him well when he leaves Ceres. In the novels, it is stated that Miller has an ex-wife, which I believe isn't mentioned in the show, so they imply this relationship with him and Muss to kind of make up for it. In fact, when I first watched this episode, I didn't really know who Muss was, and I was confused about her relationship with Miller, so I don't think it was actually handled right, and I don't think it's at all necessary to expand her character, so -2. Also, the fact he discusses Julie Mao's case with her is a change, as in the novels he doesn't talk about anyone about Julie Mao because he's assigned to handle this himself, but this wouldn't really work for the show because you need to have dialogue to explain things, so it makes sense to having him discuss the case with someone else, so I'll give that a +1. So then we get the scene where Holden and Amos board the Scopuli, which goes down pretty much exactly as it did in the books, except a few minor differences. When Amos found the little transmitter, they reasoned that not only did it lure them in there, but it was also designed to alert whoever planted it when they arrive. So then Holden freaks out and orders everyone back on board the Knight, and then they get a message from McDowell that a ship has appeared. However, in the show, they didn't freak out and run back until McDowell told them that a ship appeared. I don't know why they changed this. I think it works better when Holden already figured out that they gotta get the hell out of there, and then the ship shows up to prove him right. It seems the show seems determined to make Holden look like an idiot, so I'll give this a -2. Then the ship fires on the Canterbury, and this all happens way quicker in the show, as in the novels it takes forever for the missiles to get there, and it didn't really add anything to the story, so I'm going to give this a +1. In both the book and the show, Holden is talking to Aday as this happens, but in the show, she says, "There's something you should know," right before the ship blows up. This doesn't happen at all in the books, and frankly, this always annoyed me because we'll never know what she was going to say. The most likely outcome, I think, is to say that she was pregnant, because it's pretty much whenever you say there's something you should know, it's usually that, but who knows. I suppose that's kind of the point the show was going for, that Holden is feeling, the way that we're feeling, that he'll never know what she was going to say, so it's supposed to make us feel more sympathy for him and make the scene have more weight to it, that he'll never know what she was going to say. But really, I didn't think it added to the emotional weight. I just found it annoying, so I'm going to give that a -2. In the novels, Holden and Alex were the only ones awake. The rest of the crew were asleep due to such a high G burn that they had to use the juice for. I think it was a good choice for the show to forego this and leave them awake, so +2. Also, in both the books and the show, Holden assumes they wouldn't destroy the Canterbury because they all thought that the other ship were pirates, and so they would simply damage them so they could steal their cargo, and they were sort of preparing the Canterbury crew to surrender their cargo to them. However, in the books, Holden assumed that they were damaged even after the missiles struck. It wasn't until Alex pointed out to him that the Canterbury was nuked, and even then he didn't believe it, but really I think it works either way, so I'll give that as a 0. But overall, I think the scene in the show carries much more emotional impact with the music and the look on everyone's face. You can tell how shocked and mortified they are. Whereas in the novels, it's more of just Holden like talking it over logically. So you can feel the full weight of the loss better in the show. So I'm going to give this a +3. So that takes us to the end of the episode. So finally, the adaptation score for Dulcina is a +6. So overall, I think this episode succeeded at being a good adaptation. The stuff with Miller seemed to be the weakest link in the episode, but I think that gets better as the season goes on. The Canterbury storyline was the strength. Avasarala hardly appeared in this episode, but I just think it was great to have her at all. So all in all, a good start for the series. So that's it for my book-to-show comparison for Dulcina. I'll be back as soon as I can with more book-to-show comparisons for The Expanse, so be sure to keep an eye out for that, as well as I cover many other shows like Game of Thrones, Star Trek, Discovery, and more, so be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. Thanks a lot for watching.